I would like to move on and to hand over the floor not to Anindya Chatterjee, whom you might still have seen in the program of this workshop, but to Edgar Rodriguez, who is our main counterpart with IDRC on this overall project, and was luckily available to jump in for this opening remarks from the side of IDRC. Edgar is an expert on capacity building for public policy, economic development, and the labor market. He has extensive experiences, particularly in the South Asian region, and particularly also in regard to Myanmar, where he's program lead, and he's a senior program specialist with IDRC. Edgar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Good morning, good afternoon, and probably good evening from Asia. My name is Edgar Rodriguez, and I'm representing the International Development Research Center, or IDRC, here in New Delhi, India. I represent, on behalf of our Asia Regional Director, Dr. Anindya Chatterjee, who regrettably cannot join us today. I would like to welcome you all to this roundtable on Afghanistan. I would start by thanking the organizers, the Swiss Peace representatives, Ursina, Laurent, and the larger Swiss Peace team for putting together this important webinar that promises to be an outstanding conversation about how the international community working on research for development and peace can make a difference in fragile countries. As you may know, the OECD estimates that by 2030, 80% of the world's poor will actually be living in a fragile country. So funders for development have increasingly been expanding their investment in this type of environments to respond to the trend. But given the challenges of carrying out research in such settings, where the high levels of risk are combined with limited capacity on the ground from the state and from the systems, there is a tendency for top-down approaches, often driven from the global north. Even with the best intentions, these approaches, and I'm not excluding ourselves from those tendencies, these approaches have tended to be less attuned to social, economic, and political realities on the ground. And they tend to neglect working side by side with local actors. But this same minus is a big plus for IDRC because it offers the opportunity to fulfill our rationale, our raison d'etre. For IDRC, over the last 50 years, continues to support local voices, scholars, leaders to generate high-quality knowledge and promote the use of this evidence, of this research and knowledge into policies that can tackle the development challenges in the global south. But of course, undertaking this task is easier said than done, and it has become much harder when we deal with difficult, usually turbulent environments. Very recently, IDRC and Global Affairs Canada concluded the 5-year Knowledge for Democracy Myanmar initiative. This initiative aimed at supporting a cohort of young scholars to promote better policy research in Myanmar's emerging democracy. And as you have followed the events in that part of the world, IDRC, with the conclusion of that initiative, has drawn several lessons about working in fragile contexts. One of those key lessons has been the need to insist on working or using a systems point of view, not focus on a particular small project or segment, but on the entire system. Research systems involve different actors, as we are going to be hearing about today, individuals and institutions from many places, from think tanks, from universities, from non-government organizations, research institutes affiliated to the government, and civil society at large. These research or knowledge systems are complex and intertwined. With a good diagnosis at hand and some appetite to take risks and doing some learning, engaging in some learning by doing, the initiative, in the case of Myanmar and in general for IDRC, has accomplished substantive progress. but there are also some risks that we have to be aware of. And we can only do that if we have the proper assessment. Partner organizations such as the Global Development Network, or GDN, has launched a way to keep emphasizing this research systems approach, and they have a doing research assessment program that I invite you to check out, as those reports are groundbreaking and applies to more than a dozen countries nowadays. Today, we have this fantastic roundtable that is part of IDRC's continuous search for good practices when working to support research and researchers in the context of extreme political fragility. Our colleagues from swisspeace will focus on one of the most fragile contexts today in South Asia, which is Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, we have seen, and we saw from the year 2000 onwards, an increase in the possibilities of the prospect of research and academic freedoms. However, I mean, the return of the Taliban in this year offers great concerns to all of us, as we expect that the emerging research ecosystem of the last 2 decades will be at stake. We have already seen over the last year, and even before the fall of Kabul, targeted attacks on higher education communities that have resulted in the deaths of more than 55 scholars and students, according to our colleagues in Scholar at Risks. Some of these attacks appear to target higher education communities with concentrated population of Hazaras, a persecuted ethnic minority in the country. Of great concern to IDRC and other donors who have a very strong feminist approach in international development has been the attacks on the education of women. And for example, on August 29th, we heard with alarm that Taliban had banned co-education across the country and imposed travel restrictions on women. These and other violations are well documented in the annual report Free to Think 2021 that will be released this December by Scholars at Risk. And I also invite you to look at that report because it has a special chapter on Afghanistan. So as frightening as all this news about attacks are, what is also very frightening is the overall attitudes of the new regime towards higher education. And this September, the Education Minister, Haqqani, raised concerns over the future of higher education when he reportedly stated in a meeting with Kabul University faculty that university graduates from the past 20 years were of no use, and that those with graduate degrees in modern studies are less valuable than those who studied in religious schools. So all these developments are quite worrisome and calls for ways to look after the future of Afghan scholarship are very warranted. So I look forward to the roundtable, to the discussion, and I would like to turn to Laurent now, our moderator, and the panel, first to present the findings of the swisspeace IDRC report, and to hear from the different voices about the prospects of Afghan scholars moving forward. Thank you very much, Laurent. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Edgar, for this very substantial but also committed remarks, introductory remarks to this event. I think they also underline that IDRC is not just a funder among others happening to be active in this field, but really committed to the substance of the systems, as you mentioned, but also regarding your last remarks on the role individuals are able to play within this system. So I think we are perfectly set for what is gonna follow. And I just realized I forgot to introduce myself in the beginning, which is very unpolite. I'm gonna do this right now with a very few words. I'm the director of swisspeace and the professor of political science at the University of Basel. And in this capacity, very happy to be the moderator of this afternoon. Now, we come to the first concrete part regarding the way we have proceeded and also the way we conceptually tackled our work. And for this, I'm gonna hand over to Ursina, who is a program officer with the analysis and impact team at swisspeace. She's a historian, but has worked a lot on conflict sensitivity, on research policy, and on trainings, and bringing all this together made her the perfect match to be in charge of coordinating this research we have done for IDRC. Ursina, it's all yours.
Thank you, Laurent, for this introduction, and a warm welcome from my side to everyone. I see many familiar names, which is really encouraging to be able to present our research framework today. I will start with our assumption at the beginning of this work. If we want to advance with reducing violence, promoting peace, and generally with sustainable development, we need to look at the entire system of knowledge, as Edgar has mentioned earlier, in place, and to do so specifically in places of high risks and conflict as well. Or put differently, for good governance, democratic processes, and sustainable development in high risk or conflict-affected countries, supporting locally led research is crucial to inform and critically assess policy. The discussions around this research idea started with IDRC 2 years ago, and IDRC funded a 1.5 years research project on this. Our hypothesis was that in high risk or conflict-affected contexts, research funding needs to be sensitive to the conflict context in order to avoid unintended consequences and to be fully beneficial. This may sound simple, but it implies that funding schemes may need to be adapted. It may mean that career funding and scholarships may be beneficial in one setting, but may lead to brain drain in another. Together with IDRC, we wanted to find out how research funding can and should be adaptive, and try to find good practice on this. IDRC specifically tasked swisspeace to bring in the perspectives of researchers working from or working on these specific case study contexts. So our guiding questions was, how do researchers from the Global South view these questions? We conducted 8 case studies on Afghanistan, Cambodia, Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, El Salvador, Laos, Lebanon, and South Sudan. That is a group of 13 researchers in Switzerland, South Sudan, Côte d'Ivoire, Laos, and Australia. I also see many of you present here. A warm special welcome to you. Over the past almost 2 years, the case study research was informed by desk research and over 140 interviews, both remote, since we started this project at the beginning of the pandemic, but some also in person. We interviewed researchers, research managers, and other key informants who work on the section between science and policy. Now, how did we apply a knowledge ecosystems approach? In a well-functioning and independent research environment, security risks and political sensitivities are relatively low, and academic freedom is mostly guaranteed, such as maybe in Switzerland or Canada. In authoritarian or dysfunctional settings, however, like Laos or South Sudan, researchers are hampered, research infrastructures are limited, and policy-relevant research is more difficult to conduct, or if it exists, it may not be considered or taken up by policymakers. This is a variety of reasons. Power imbalances are heightened, which leads to censorship. Further power imbalances may lead to donor-driven agendas and approaches that are disconnected from contextual realities. We wanted to find out how to alleviate these challenges, how to identify entry points by adopting such a knowledge ecosystems approach. The term knowledge ecosystems, as we understand it, includes the entire process from research to policy, from agenda setting to deciding on research methodologies, data collection and research conduct, up until peer review, publication, and finally policy uptake. And as Edgar has also mentioned, actors in a knowledge ecosystem include researchers, but not only, also universities, NGOs, translators, policymakers, or also the media. The research goal of strengthening knowledge ecosystem as defined jointly with IDRC, thus centered on capturing local perspectives and insights from researchers of the Global South to understand the nature and workings of knowledge ecosystems in our case studies. Working with a knowledge ecosystem thinking, we needed to understand both the demand for research, so who finances research, who sets the agenda, who asks for research results, as well as who supplies research and knowledge. We adopted a political economy analysis approach. I won't go into too many details, but within the knowledge ecosystems, we try to follow the persons who conducts research, what is their biography and professional life. Try to follow the funding. This was the most difficult one. Try to understand where research resources come from, where they flow to, where do researchers get salaries from, do they pay a living, etc. We followed institutions and also ideas to understand the pathways and relevance of scientific content towards outreach and policy. With our choice of case studies, we focused on research in contexts affected by conflicts and political and security risks. The knowledge ecosystems assessed in these case studies are all characterized by low to middle demand of research that is in many cases externally driven, for example, by international donors. And they are characterized by an environment that is not very or not at all enabling for researchers. A further commonality among the different cases was that research is produced outside of traditional research institutions, for example, by NGOs, think tanks, and often also outside the respective country. This is why it was important to look at the entire system of knowledge production and not just at what is officially labeled as research institution. So what are our key findings? What can research donors do to strengthen a research environment that is conducive to knowledge production in high-risk contexts? A recommendation or a few recommendations we found for almost all case studies is the need to invest in long-term programs that allow for consistency and predictability. They then form incentives for researchers to remain longer in the same place or to return to respective case. Further, given the volatile nature of high-risk countries, research donors who promote adaptive research and flexible implementation, such as we were able to do with implementing a research project during times of a pandemic, such flexible implementation is more likely to produce relevant results. To mention just the last more general recommendation we found in most case studies, in disputed or weak political governance systems that lack legitimacy, researchers need to find the subtle and innovative ways of conveying criticism to policymakers or to engage policymakers indirectly and through more informal channels. Supporting researchers to navigate between these more or less confrontational science policy dialogues can involve opening doors to policy discussions for these researchers, but it also involves budgeting science policy communication. If we look at more weak or distorted knowledge ecosystems, as for example, South Sudan, funding on a structural level can significantly benefit institution building. This could be in the form of core funding to research institutes and supporting physical and virtual research infrastructure. Investing in research infrastructure in a distorted knowledge ecosystem like South Sudan may take a long breath, but could eventually be more beneficial or more sustainable than only, in brackets, supporting individual careers of researchers who then leave the country. So while individual funding is important, such as PhD or postdoc programs to build research capacities. And in a crisis like Afghanistan has experienced in August this year, this could involve also supporting researchers in diaspora, as we will maybe discuss later on. If we look at knowledge ecosystems that are positively transitioning, funding on a structural level is recommended to focus on good governance of research, to create maybe faculty exchange programs, to support universities or think tanks, to engage proactively in science policy dialogues if there are such entry points to be found. And last slide on recommendations, if we look at authoritarian settings or distorted knowledge ecosystems, as we found in the Laos case study, it is difficult to tackle structural issues through funding on an institutional level. Institutions are often too closely linked to authorities to contribute to any form of change. Thus, access via individuals may be more promising, for example, through scholarships. This could help to retain skilled and young researchers, to alleviate the shortage of qualified researchers, and support the culture of creative critical thinking to promote social change through research. Now, just as a teaser for you to continue reading on these case studies, I will show you the smart spider visualization we used to characterize these knowledge ecosystems along 6 dimensions. As you can see here, academic freedom, democratic government, the amount of research uptake that is happening, how conducive a infrastructure is to conduct research, the safety and security for researchers, and then finances and funding available for research. And within these 6 scoring division, we developed indicators on a quantitative basis using proxy indicators such as the Academic Freedom Index, but we also spoke to the respective case study researchers. And for Afghanistan, this would then turn into a smart spider like this, indicating tendencies. As you see, for Afghanistan, unfortunately, at least what our graph says, not very encouraging. So to wrap up, you'll find all our case study reports soon published on our website. We'll also send you an email, since we now have your email addresses from the registration of this roundtable. Not spamming you further, I promise. Finally, let me return to our assumption from the beginning. If we want to advance with reducing violence and promoting peace, and generally with sustainable development, we need to strengthen the entire ecosystem of knowledge. So this is also a call to the aid and development sectors that tend to focus on primary education. Strong higher education and independent research are crucial to inform society and critically assess policy in conflict-affected contexts. Consequently, research funding needs to be adapted to the specific context in order to be relevant and to avoid unintended consequences. And it's now my great pleasure to hand over first to Laurent to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Ursina, for this really condensed overview of what we have been doing, and focusing at the end with a smart spider also on Afghanistan. And with this, I'm happy to hand over without any delays to Nishank Motwani. Nishank is Director of Research of AREU Consulting, and Deputy Director of AREU, the Afghan Research and Evaluation Unit. And I'm very happy to have you with us here this afternoon. Nishank, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Laurent, for the introduction, and Ursina for setting the stage. I'm really grateful to be able to present before you, and also to see that IDRC is here. Thank you, everyone. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to be talking about the Afghanistan case study, and the way I'm going to go about it is to give you a brief overview of what, who it was that we spoke to, talk about some of the key findings that emerged from it in terms of what was going well, and then look at the impediments from the structural perspective, also looking at impediments that the interviewees themselves identified, looking at specifically looking at donors and the gap between research and policy. I will then go and talk about some of the recommendations that the interviewees made when we spoke to them. I should also say, for obvious reasons, these interviews were conducted before the fall of the Afghan government. So some of the material that I will be presenting should be taken from the view that this was prior to the Taliban's return. And when we have the Q&A session further after my presentation, that would be a really good opportunity to talk about some of the more relevant recommendations in the current new political reality that has taken hold of the country. So let me begin by giving you a quick overview in terms of when the research was conducted. The research was conducted from September last year until July of this year. And the interviews themselves were semi-structured interviews. We spoke to civil society organizations, universities, both public and private, and government departments with research units. Some of these interviews were conducted for a second time because there was just such a wealth of material that we wanted to capture, and interviews were very generous with their time. In terms of what was working well, let me kick off by talking about that. Bulk of the interviewees acknowledged the fact that there was a significant growth in civil society-led research organizations, and that have published a lot of material over the last 20 years. They've also noted that due to the expansion and also the emergence of new research organizations on the ground, it's also led to the opportunity for Afghans to expand and enhance their research capacity, and it's provided invaluable analysis that's come from the ground itself. These views that have come from the ground, they're by no means comprehensive in that, because the research capacity and the research capacity base of the country is still quite limited, but nevertheless, it showed that there's significant scope for these views to be heard and for these views to be meaningful. Another point that the researchers we learned from the interviews was that the researchers themselves, lacking that formal institutionalized learning that comes from going through rigorous master's and PhD programs, they fill that gap by studying themselves. They were self-motivated, and they self-taught and trained individuals, both in terms of qualitative and quantitative research methods. And the impact of that was that their voices were more heard at the local, national, and international audiences. And I'll come back to that a bit later in terms of the impediments. The Afghan researchers that we spoke to in terms of their presence were gaining traction, but still there was a significant gap to fill. And the strengths that they noted, what they said that really stood out for them was in terms of their language proficiency, their access across the country, their contextual knowledge about provincial and district level communities, which is really difficult for foreign researchers or consultants to replicate. So they have these advantages which can make a significant impact if they're utilized well. And also the last point that they noted, where there was a large degree of consensus around, was that there was that Afghan researchers were able to apply and to obtain greater attention to issues and to position them in front of both the former government and international partners to take action. In terms of what would, and now I'm going to talk about the challenges. Let me begin by talking about what were some of the structural challenges that researchers that we spoke to from the different organizations talked about. This would come as no surprise, but security challenges, and especially since from 2020 onwards, the COVID-19 public health considerations significantly limited the ability for researchers to go out into the field and to be able to collect data and to speak to people. Since the signing of the Doha deal, but also going back to the end of ISAF on 31st December 2014, it meant that donor priorities had started shifting, and there was notable changes to funding structures, and funding itself was limited in the country. And what that meant was that as funding was being cut down, there was an increasing number of people who were competing for the same diminishing pool of resources that were available. Decades long of conflict, of course, in the country has had the detrimental impact of of there being very limited investment in the higher education sector for scientific research, and this is reflected in the fact of the lack of Afghan academic journals in Afghanistan itself, and the very limited number of publications that have come out by university professors at Afghan universities, both public and private. The risk of threats, intimidation, and interference in the country was significant, and that has meant that researchers self-censored and did not necessarily go and could research freely on topics that were considered controversial. And topics that are considered controversial, of course, that can be subjective, but in the case of Afghanistan, they covered a range of areas, including gender-based violence, corruption, opium poppy, as well as looking at networks related to corruption within the Afghan government, their ties to potentially international organizations and donors. And that was something that researchers said that they felt increasingly concerned about being able to write about those matters, because with the international presence in the country drying up, it meant that there would be lesser safeguards in place to help them. Another limitation was that research barely exists in either public or private universities, and universities have very limited funds to allocate for research. And I'll elaborate on that point, which is that the Afghan education model for higher education was primarily driven on the basis of teaching. The larger the number of teaching, the larger the number of classes, the more the amount of revenue, which meant that the model of universities primarily was anchored in the number of students that they were able to attract to their classes, and not dedicate towards research funding. And as a consequence of that, there was the research where research was conducted was primarily in the NGO sphere. Government units that had research units, which I'll come to in a bit, virtually conducted no research at all. And there was some interesting conversations that we had with researchers who said that, in all honesty, we don't even know what these government departments that have research institutes do, because they haven't produced a single report. And one of the common jokes that was made was that on the websites it would say the research reports are coming soon, but they never did come. And but this also reflects another point, which is that although on the one hand the government institutions did not have research production, but on the other hand they didn't have the resources to actually use the research that was being produced by NGOs. And there was a significant gap between policy and research in terms of how do people in government actually make use of the research that is coming out. It was as good, the way someone characterized it to me was that it was as if people were speaking in two different languages. A significant volume of the research that was conducted in Afghanistan has been in English, and there's only one, I would say, notable exception to that, which was the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, which is where I used to work, where the research was produced in both Dari and Pashto, and it was uploaded online. This is not to say that AREU is doing it exclusively, but it was more systematic in its approach. And lastly, in terms of the structural impediments constraining research, was that the way in which the research agendas were set was quite project-based and not looking at it the larger picture, or looking at how it intersects with other domains, other thematic areas. And what it meant was that the adoption of a project-based approach to research meant that it was quite piecemeal and not part of larger programs. Donors played an essential role in setting up the research basis of the research base in Afghanistan. But at the same time, due to their shifting priorities, it often meant that the research potential was constrained, and it also limited sustainable capacity development. I'd already talked about the project-based approach, but the project-based approach was perhaps more pernicious because it meant that the project-based approach funding, because funding was primarily premised on project-based funding, especially from 2015 onwards, it meant that core funding, which is essentially needed to build up that capacity at research institutions, was missing. And as more organizations were competing for a smaller pool of resources that were diminishing, it meant that they really were unable to invest in capacities. It also meant that they were unable to publish as much as they would have liked to, and were writing primarily for donors, and the literature that they were producing was not published to the extent that they would have liked or hoped for, because that would be owned by the donor. So there was, which comes to the second point, which was that the project-based funding approach detracted also from the ability for Afghans to take the lead in publishing their own reports. It often meant that they would rely on or collaborate with international consultants to get just to meet project deadlines and to submit the research reports, which meant that the in-house capacity that's required to develop and the time it takes to collect the data, to analyze the data, and to write the report would not meet with the project deadlines, and that required increasing reliance on international consultants to finish the project and go on and apply and bid for the next one. One of the problems that came up repeatedly in the conversations was that donors were increasingly using NGOs for field work. So the way it was described was that Afghan researchers were, it was extractive in the sense that that rather than giving them the opportunity to produce and have their name on the report, Afghan researchers were increasingly being reduced to data collection, and that restrained their capacity development. It limited their growth opportunities and restricted the extent to which the local researchers had a say and could shape research findings and outputs, because they were not involved in the writing part of it, but were increasingly being contracted by donors to gather data from the field because they could, whereas international consultants were, even if they were located in the country, had significant restrictions imposed on them for security reasons. And in cases where they were not restricted moving around, their language limitations would mean that they were reliant on Afghan researchers to provide them with that data. But quite often, that collaboration between Afghan researchers and the international consultants did not go ahead. And lastly, to a point that I'd raised earlier, was that the funding priorities and the diminishing pool of the funds in Afghanistan meant that not only was there a diminishing pool, but it also meant that there were changes to what would be funded. So organizations that perhaps were not working in a particular area had no choice but to bid for funding in a particular area, because that would be the difference between staying afloat or simply shuttering. Moving on to the gap between research and policy, and that was quite an interesting part of the conversation, because after 20 years of development funding pouring into the country, the point that came up repeatedly in the conversations was that how little there was that was coming out in terms of research from government departments that were essentially set up to carry out research and to help bridge the gap between policy and research by producing the research internally, and also to engage with researchers outside. At the same time, the researchers from civil society organizations and universities said that the value of research in government was not often recognized, and they were often unsure what to do when they received a research report, and that goes back to the early example in which I said it seemed as though the individuals, both the people producing the research and the end users, were speaking in different languages altogether. Prior to the collapse of the Afghan government, there were certain areas in which the researchers felt that neutrality and impartiality of research was coming under greater stress due to competing agendas of donors and, on the other hand, the Afghan government. So the researchers found themselves in a difficult place where they were being funded by a donor and were writing a report that would be utilized by or should have been utilized by the Afghan government. But as the divide between donors and the Afghan government was increasing on certain matters, it became increasingly hard for researchers to be able to write based on the evidence on the ground. And one of the key themes that came up was on this, on writing about the Doha agreement, where Afghan researchers found it increasingly difficult to take a line that would critique the Doha agreement and to be on the other side of things, because the international consensus was at that point that this has to work, and so they found it difficult to be able to write openly without coming under the pressure from the funding sources. And to the point that they noted was that it meant that they decided not to write about those matters because they didn't want to undermine their own credibility by writing about something that they did not fundamentally believe in, or the evidence that they gathered did not back up themselves. And lastly, on the point was that the Afghan researchers that we spoke to said that Afghan researchers' voices were missing from the research that was carried out about their country, and their presence at times, which was there at the table, was often considered tokenistic and was not really there in a meaningful role to contribute to strategic policy debates, and that they felt increasingly sidelined and that their voices were not effectively heard. In terms of some of the recommendations that they made about what donors could do better in Afghanistan, and noting the fact that the context has significantly changed, but of course there are other contexts that are where some of these recommendations may be applicable, provided that they are contextualized. One of the key things that they noted about donors was that the donor priorities need to be better aligned with knowledge generation and to help build that culture of research. Without a culture of research and the model where the research is conducted by international consultants is not the way that's going to allow a research base in the country to be built. The second point they noted was that donors need to be able to expand core funding and have a long-term view to conducting research in the country and supporting local institutions. The project-based approach had, as I've mentioned before, had imposed significant limitations in being able to build capacities for research for individuals, but also for research organizations not being able to have control over their research agendas, because most of the time they're trying to find the next funding from the next project. And that meant that they were not able to support the capacity development, but also have the opportunity to invest the resources to be able to publish their own independent research reports and findings. And lastly, in relation to the donors, was that the researchers noted that because of the growing gulf between the Afghan government and the donors, it meant that research organizations and individual researchers found themselves caught in the middle between these two, or in Afghanistan's case, multiple different parties, and being in the difficult position of trying to write about what they want to pursue in a credible manner, but at the same time being pushed around by different parties who were seeking to prioritize their own agendas. In other words, the research agenda that ought to have been impartial and free was coming under increasing stress. One other point about donors that I would like to add before closing was that the donor interventions, the
I have the impression. No, Nishank, you first disappeared totally. Now you're back, but muted. But now maybe you could start again. I think you just were about to start with your very, very, very last recommendation.
Oh, great. I thought I was mute for the whole thing. I'm so sorry.
No worries, no worries.
That would have been a disaster. My last point was that for donors, was that the recommendation that was made was not to approach each project as providing some grand solution. There needs to be this recognition that projects and research that are being conducted are not necessarily going to find solutions. And this is about expanding our understanding of a growing problem. So if a solution is that we understand a problem better, that's great, but not to treat the problems as and for each single project to be able to tackle a particular problem and find that solution, because there's a requirement to conduct more research to get a better understanding of the intersectional dynamics that are at play, and for other researchers and other voices who have not been engaged to be given the opportunity to take part in the research. So I'm going to end there, and if we have questions later, I'd be very happy to go back to my notes and talk about the research that was conducted early in the year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nishank. I know it's always a challenge to present a whole case study in a few minutes. And personally, I have the feeling it's even worse having to do this in a virtual setting in a few minutes, but you did great. And we will now move on to the panelists and to the panel discussion. And Nishank will also be part of this panel, but he will more be kind of a passive resource person, so he will not start with an additional comment as he already presented the case study. So let me just very briefly introduce the three additional persons who will be participating in the panel. I'm saying three because unfortunately Orzala Nemat is not with us. She is the director of AREU, and apparently she didn't make it. But with Nishank, we have the deputy director of AREU. So we will still have Bohdan Krawchenko, who is Dean of the Graduate School of Development at the University of Central Asia, a university supported jointly by Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and the Afghan Foundation, and surely known to all of you. We also have with us Qayoom Suroush, who has worked for the Afghan Analyst Network and Human Rights Watch, and also for AREU at a certain point of his career. And finally, we also have with us Ali Yawar Adili, who is director of the Afghan Analyst Network and has also worked for various UN agencies. And I'm just seeing that apparently, even though I don't see her, we also have Orzala, who joined in. So I'm very happy that she also is with us. Orzala, I already introduced her while excusing her. She's the director of the Afghan Research and Evaluation Unit, and she's also chair of the Open Societies Foundation's Afghan Advisory Board. This being said, I will start, as we only have a short panel, with a quick individual question addressed to each panelist, and I'll start with Bohdan, following the same sequencing as we have in the program. Bohdan, you've mentioned to me when we had a short preliminary exchange before the roundtable started. You mentioned to me that you also had a paar direct comments regarding to the case study. So you're very welcome to start with this few comments regarding the case study. And then I would like to hear from you with your perspective, also a bit from abroad, but still within the region. What, in your view, are the three most important challenges for the Afghan research system since the regime change, which occurred in August? Bohdan, you have the floor.
I'll try to deal with what is the perspective for today, but just let me mention that the University of Central Asia is active in Afghanistan. We have 7 learning centers that are operational, and we actually are conducting research. So, so much was said by the other authors. I want to pick up on a very different topic that was not fleshed out in the report and in general hasn't been discussed, and that is the role of the universities. When all is said and done, globally, universities are the most critical producers of knowledge. And when you have a situation where universities and they are the critical component of any kind of knowledge ecosystem. This is the case in Pakistan and so many other countries, including low-income countries. What you had in Afghanistan is a very unusual situation, and that's because when the Taliban came to power, there were only 7,000 students, no women. There were no universities. And in the course of quite a number of years, by 2019, you had 450,000 students, 30% women. Kabul University has 40% women. Herat has 53% women. This effort created the largest mass of educated people the country has ever seen. This effort did not receive donor support, which I think is staggering. If you look at the sum total of overseas development assistance, 1.4% went to university education. Higher education, an educated population is absolutely critical to economic development, social development, and all sorts of things. And public universities were caught in a very bad bind because there was the constitutional provision that education was free. So they got a paltry amount of money from the government, virtually no support from abroad, but they allowed private universities to develop, who could charge fees, and of course, it is from the more research activity that one has seen in recent years actually has come from private universities. I'm thinking, for example, of Kardan University that has launched even a couple of decent peer review journals with international editorial boards. I read the last issue that they had on small business, and that was pretty good. But the other big problem was, of course, that at universities, you had only until recently 4% of university faculty with PhDs. That's 200 people and only 8 women. And you had 31% had master's degrees and 68% had bachelor's qualifications. So, you can't expect very much research when the emphasis was, of course, on teaching, and there was no money, and that happened. But in the last couple of years, something very interesting thing that has happened, and I think that's very relevant for today. And that is that thousands and thousands of people were sent to do masters. A smaller group went on to do PhDs. Large numbers of them were in South Asia. We keep talking about North-South. It's very important to understand that there should be the South-South bit. And quite a number of areas, in certain areas of economics, in agricultural, environmental sciences, developed at universities reasonably well because people returned with PhDs and master's degrees from these universities. And so you now have a situation that, for example, in Kabul, at the Faculty of Agriculture, it has a staff of 46, 26 are PhDs. This never happened a couple of years ago. At Bamyan University, out of the staff of 13 in the Ag department, 6 are PhDs. Now, one has talked a lot about research organizations that have been funded by government. One can talk about NGOs that delivered almost $1 billion worth of technical assistance, and that has come to an end. Many of these research organizations have shut, and what remains are the universities that are proved to be the thing that was sustained and remained after the Taliban took over. And I don't think there's much that we can do with them, and certainly we can't throw them under the bus. Bear in mind that private universities are open and they're teaching classes. There are variations on how that is done. Public universities are not open, but the staff is there and keen to do research. They're still trying to figure out how do you do segregated teaching in a place like Herat, where 53% of the student population was girls. But I think that under these circumstances, I mean, it's a separate discussion on how one organizes a knowledge diaspora. But I think under these circumstances, it's fairly important to try to have research projects with scholars in the West that connect to their colleagues at these universities, which have these clusters where there are people with PhDs. Well, assuming, of course, you can get money to them, because that's a problem, and deal with subjects that are not highly political, but are absolutely under-researched by the big organizations. And that deals with certain aspects of economics, that deals with a whole bunch of livelihoods, that deals with a whole bunch of issues of improving agricultural production, natural resources management, and this sort of thing. And I think that this is fairly important to do, and I think this is possible. Let me just make one point about research and government. Listen, if I was an enemy of the Afghan people, I would have the system of governance that existed in that country. There was no policy process. And if there is no policy process, it's very difficult to know where do you come in with your policy paper. But also, there was virtually nothing done to build policy capacity in the policy units. One of the few things that happened was the master's program in economic policy that we did for the Ministry of Finance. And by the way, the policy department of the Ministry of Finance, basically most of the same people are there. I'm going to close now because there are many people who have things to say. I think we have no choice but to go back and engage, because that has never really happened on any scale with universities. I think there's a role for the Afghan scholars who are in the diaspora. I know some PhD students that really need assistance in order to complete their thesis. Of course, it's going to be difficult. We don't know what space this is going to be, but I see no alternative other than to try to do that.
Thank you very much, Bohdan. Orzala, I assume you're still with us, even though I don't see your face. But I welcome. I'll move on to you. I assume you have had the possibility to listen to what has been going on over the first part of this meeting, and well, feel free to comment on what was said, both by Nishank and by Bohdan. But what I would like to hear also from you in particular is how do you see, how do you judge the possibilities to to do research in Afghanistan the same way AREU has been doing it over the past year in the near and middle future. You have the floor, Ursala.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by sincerely apologizing for missing the first hour of the session due to some issues with internet connection. I'm in fact in transition, traveling from one point to another. Usually my assumption was that my internet on phone will work and I will be able to operate, but you know, sometimes technology is not too much on our side. It's a great honor to be part of this panel. I would like to start with congratulating Dr. Nishank, my former colleague and friend, obviously, and also Mr. Nishank for an excellent paper that they have put together. And I think it's also timely because we are at this juncture in point in our situation in Afghanistan, where I think more than any other time, revisiting the question of knowledge production and the question of policy research is important. Just following Mr. Bohdan's comments, I'd like to have some quick remarks in terms of the human capacity aspects of the issue, and then I will move to some other points that I'd like to share with everyone in this panel. I think excellent points were definitely made in terms of the need for capacity, but some broader questions are there in terms of seeing things happening with regards to focus on capacity development, on doing an actual research in Afghanistan. And most of you who are familiar with me formerly, but especially since I take over the AREU leadership, is sharing this concern that most of our national staff has generally been trained or their capacity building was mostly focused on basically extracting data and gathering data from the field rather than actually being able to be part of the analysis, part of the research itself. So really, as we move forward, we should really rethink this idea of using local partners as data extractors versus using them or bringing them as partners and bringing them as part of the decision-making process. I think it's really critical in that sense. And also, let me also be quite critical of our own national higher education system. Unfortunately, and I'm also very pleased that I have another former colleague here, Qayoom Suroush, one of our colleagues in AREU conducting research. And maybe Qayoom will speak firsthand about this, but our higher education system is also not contributing really in the real sense in terms of training people on offering or providing research. Methodologically, ethically, especially, there are not enough courses that social science students or political science students or legal or any other subject for that matter are given. And that also needs, I mean, well, now with the new situation that I will just come to talk about very quickly, I think that's also another challenge that we have to look. Another point that I would like to sort of make here is regarding the offering of scholarships. Mr. Bohdan, you were talking about it, and I very much agree with the fact that most of the, focus of former sort of offering of scholarship is all about social science or political science. Easy subjects, if I may say, as someone from the development field, but also not on technical aspects. At AREU, we faced tremendously the challenge when we were looking, for example, for experts on water sector, for experts, Afghan experts on mining sectors, for Afghan experts on specific technical sort of geographical issues and matters, climate matters, and so forth. There are, if the proportion of scholarships offered in social or political science is much higher than the other natural sciences, for example, which we hope to be sort of revisited as we move forward. Now, I think in the next part, I would like to also refer to the current situation. I'm very pleased to communicate through this platform that AREU is currently fully active on the ground. We have all our staff and our office open in Afghanistan. And we've just finalized the new AREU strategy, which is going to highlight for the next year as a transition year, research and studies mostly focusing on humanitarian assistance and revisiting some different aspects of it, economic development and natural resources management. So thematically, these will be the priorities for AREU for the next year. As we are also testing water in different ways in terms of the new regime, the regime change, and how this is going to sort of work. Operationally speaking, research under the new sort of context, I think there are major challenges that we need. It's too early to talk about and we need to revisit. One, I think, was briefly also referred earlier by a colleague panelist, is regarding the policy engagement, the nature of policy engagement at this point, where you have counterparts in the ruling force or the ruling regime that may not necessarily believe in the same system of policy engagement as before. So we are trying to sort of find ways of being more creative in sense of ensuring that AREU's analysis, its evidence-based research is contributing in those thematic areas that I was mentioning into the new circumstances, the new sort of regime change situation. We are also looking into this in terms of possibility of reaching out to the field, different parts of Afghanistan. Relatively speaking, stability and security in terms of physical security to researchers so far has been not a major challenge, and this is because we haven't really fully operationalized field research. But we are in a waiting and seeing the situation at this stage. The hopes are that in this part, we will be able to sort of set up a kind of a guideline for our researchers to be able to figure out how to sort of operate under the new circumstances. That is meaning conducting field research, following the ethical aspect of the research, obviously based on the guidelines, and also testing the behavior of the ruling regime towards the researchers. And there are some alarming, concerns, because in the average mindset of Taliban, maybe researchers are seen as spies, quote unquote. And that really requires a lot of sort of scrutiny by the organization, by the researchers, by those who are sort of in the funding in partnership and outside Afghanistan, how to communicate the findings of this evidence-based research that is not harmful for the researcher, for the informants, for all those people who are involved in the process from point A to point Z, So these are sort of things that needs to be seen. We are in the process of figuring out how to sort of operate under the new circumstances. And in general, also revisiting the question of, for example, AREU as a policy research organization, to see where is the right time and moment and place where we can do solely knowledge production for the sake of knowledge production, meaning academic and analytical research without necessarily connecting it to policy implications, and where are areas within these teams that we were talking about where we can do also policy, sort of expand the research mostly in terms of its policy implications and recommendations that we were saying. And of course, last but not least, I'm ending here, I'm sure my time is probably up, is the importance of identifying the more sort of, as I mentioned earlier, the creative ways of engaging constructively in the policy circles with such a regime that has a very different approach. So we hope that we will find that way. Once again, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure and honor joining you, and looking forward to listen to others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orzala, for this very rich input. Also, you just happen to be in technical transition. And thank you also for sensing my attempt to manage time. It's always a little bit more tricky in a remote way without being all too blunt. I'll move on to Qayoom. I've sent you also a question regarding particularly the perspectives for young Afghan researchers in today's perspective. But feel free also to get back to one or the other points which were raised by your predecessors, and please bear with me, don't be too long. Qayoom, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And as mentioned, my apologies because of the noise. I didn't have a good connection at home, so I moved to a coffee to have a better connection. It's a great pleasure to be in such great panelists, and some great points was made by my former director, Dr. Orzala Nemat, and also our colleagues, the research by Dr. Nishank. We totally understand that the education system in Afghanistan was, because it's now, we don't know how it will be the same or not, based on teaching, purpose. They're trying to teach rather than to based on doing research, especially the public universities, which I'm also a graduate of it. The Kabul University is totally based on teaching students more theoretical aspects of the books or knowledge rather than letting them or teaching them to do the research by their own. So that question will be even now more important, and would be really to I would really be keen to look to what will happen with the new regime, if they're gonna change anything to better, if not to worse, which I suspect that might happen as well. On the as others also mentioned, of course there was a big disconnections between what they have been produced by some research organization, including like organization like AREU, Afghan Analyst Networks, and other, and with what the Afghan government was doing, because they were not that policy process of going back to research, asking researchers to do something for policy, and then trying to make a decision based on the policy. And that again will be worse, because this new regime will not be based on any kind of research, and look to the people they appointed. Most of them are, the only qualification they have are their Maulawis, their religious scholars, their school. So that will be another huge challenge for new Afghanistan, the new regime. And then another challenge that we had in Afghanistan, me as a researcher was always saying that the research that was conducted, most of it was based on the project. They were interested in project or somehow fulfilling a big, policy decisions, like let's say the co-insurgents, the project that was meant to win the hearts and minds of Afghans. So they did research to find evidence for such kind of the project they had in their minds. No one was interested really in Afghan culture. Very few could be, or Afghan people per se. Rather, they were interested in how to make success, how to make look on a project more successful to their donors or to those who they are reporting. And that was a huge gap. I hope when the international community engage back to Afghanistan, they will be more interested in Afghan people, their culture, their way of living, their system of education, all these things, rather than trying to figure out a quick fix way of how to understand this country or how to implement a project for the military or for the other purposes. For the question you sent about what the prospect I see for Afghan young researcher here, I think, well, a large number of them have already left the country, and unfortunately, I'm really glad to see or to hear that the AREU has continued to work in Afghanistan. But as you know, it's very hard to work with an authoritarian regime. You don't know where is their limits, where are their, their red lines. That could be any publication they don't like, and it's not more hierarchy as well. It could, a foot soldier might happen to not like your research, and they could stop your field researcher, or might come to your office. Working with an authoritarian regime is not easy, especially now that the Taliban, there is a total uncertainty of even if they accept research as a research culture at all. So that's another big concern for me. Another concern for young researcher is the period 2000-2001, prior to the collapse of the ex-Taliban regime. There was some gatekeepers of the information for the Afghanistan, which they become named then minister, deputy ministers, and get lots of positions, I'm afraid that might happen again, and some gatekeeper of knowledge for the Afghanistan, be foreigner or Afghan, provide knowledge for this all policy making, even for humanitarians, considering that there will be much less field research in Afghanistan because of the current situation, security situation, and uncertainties that are now happening in the country. So we might have now a new gatekeepers, knowledge gatekeepers, who will let will inform policy circle here and there without much hearing from real Afghan researcher on the ground. Thanks so much. If I may, that's all for now. Thank you.
Qayoom, excellent. Thank you so much for your availability. Also, even in the coffee backup, I think many people from quiet offices are not as structured in their contributions to other panels, not to this one, of course, as you are now in this particular setting. Having said this, I'll hand over and rush to Ali. The same counts for you, Ali. I mean, feel free to comment on one or the other elements which were already made, but maybe also try to say a few words to the question I sent you regarding the future of policy analysis.
Yeah, thank you, Laurent, and many thanks to swisspeace for organizing this great event, and of course, congratulations to Dr. Nishank on his on this great report. I just would like to comment on the role of the university. Unfortunately, I agree with Professor Bohdan that there is now a great, a huge capacity in the universities, because many lecturers or professors who studied abroad in India or in Europe and the US, and they return to the country. But unfortunately, there isn't any research-based approach within the universities. And I think it will be very important to help these universities or the higher education of Afghanistan to develop such sort of approach. For example, now my colleagues and I traveled to Bohdan in 2009, and we wanted to research about the impact of climate change on agriculture and livelihoods in Bohdan. We met with some university lecturers in Bohdan, and they had a lot of ideas and knowledge about the agriculture in Bohdan, but unfortunately there isn't any research production by this university lecturers. So the most important thing is to help them develop a sort of research-based approach. And regarding the question about the role of policy analysis, I think it all depends somehow on the international engagement with the new power holders in Afghanistan, because the international community is yet to figure out how to engage with the new power holders in Afghanistan. And why it depends on international engagement, because so for many organizations and even the research centers, is Dr. Nishank mentioned, in the universities, they have somehow depended on the funding from the international community. If that funding is not there, then many of these research organizations will struggle. And the second thing is that, of course, it is very difficult, because during their insurgency, the Taliban never formulated their policy positions regarding various political, social, economic issues. And since they came to power, they have not established any policy processes. It is mainly, they are somehow mainly adopting guidelines, which are through different government agencies on a separate and random basis. or these policy positions come from random statements from the officials. For example, as Edgar mentioned earlier, we saw that the acting Minister of Higher Education, Abdul Baqi Haqqani, in early October said that the foundation of education should be laid down from the scratch, and students should be educated according to our values. And this comes at on a very random basis, and there isn't any policy process to see how the Taliban really adopt their positions regarding the education and higher education in the country. And the second thing is, I think it depends also, the policy analysis is affected by the fragmentation of research ecosystem. By that I mean that we will see like a decreased role of Afghan researchers, at least on temporary basis, because many of them have left the country or struggling to build a new home or new life in other countries. And we also see, like in early 2000s, the role of foreign researchers, because they can now somehow go back to the country, and there is also less hostility towards foreigners from the government officials or from the Taliban officials. And the second thing is that Afghan researchers were somehow affected personally, because they were part of a generation that developed in the last 20 years, and they also had some sort of normative approach to the turmoil and upheavals in Afghanistan, and it has somehow affected their the way they want to figure how to approach their careers and research and contribute to knowledge production. And the other thing is, and the third point that I wanted to make is that there is now the research and also knowledge production is somehow facing a limitation, and also it is affected by some sort of tendency towards narrative building, and it also affects, for example, journalism research. I can give the example, for example, BBC report on 27 September 2021. The title was "In Rural Afghanistan, a Family Welcomes Taliban Rule." And this is about one woman in Marja district of Helmand province who lost 4 of her sons. But I think it is very important, and a very important report, but it has 2 major problems. One is that the research team or the journalism team had to be escorted by one Taliban fighter, and also a translator that had to be chosen by Taliban themselves. And therefore, it shows 2 major problems. One is the restriction on freedom of opinion and freedom of free flow of information. And second, there has been like this tendency to problematize women's issue and other issues as rural and urban dichotomy. Otherwise, for example, we also have Afghanistan Analyst Network had a research about the women's opinions from rural villages and from rural areas about peace process. And of course, the findings were that they had the same concerns about war and peace, about the development and their rights to education as those who lived in urban areas. So I would stop here now, and if there are any questions, then of course.
Thank you very much also to you, Ali. So now we have a structural problem because formally our time is over. but I think we cannot stop here. So we'll give it another 5 to maximum 10 minutes. And those who have to leave, I hope not the panelists, those who have to leave, they leave. But in 10 minutes, for sure, I promise, we will stop. But I would like to take at least one or the other question which came up in the chat. And one actually just links up to what you, Ali, now touched about in your last sentences. It states, I'm just picking out one or the other sentence, that most research which is being done focuses on urban areas. And what about the need for more research done on and in rural areas? Are there perspectives for this? Is this somehow realistic? I think this also relates to the structure of universities or other research institutions being present or not as research institutions, and not only as teaching and education institutions in rural areas. Who would like to chip in on this question? You can just raise your hand physically. This is easier for me to see. Bohdan, please.
Yeah, just a couple of points. The reason why you could not develop research, a research culture and research capacity in Afghan universities was primarily a question of funding. People came back from Japan, from Malaysia. The only research that they could do was because they were supported by their colleagues in Japan who would provide the, and I'm talking about agriculture and livelihoods and this sort of thing. When we had a project, you mentioned Bamyan University, we had a project with Bamyan University, it's called peanuts. And as a result of that, they came up with new varieties of drought-resistant beans that is going to make a very big difference to the livelihoods of people. So if nothing was done, 1.1% of overseas assistance went to higher education, how's it going to fall from manna? And I think that there are people there that are very capable. I think that one of the things that we need to do in this period is to really start working with them, with courses and this kind of stuff. We certainly intend to do that. And that Bamyan University submitted and got published in a top peer-reviewed journal the results of their research. It's possible to do. You just have, and they're really smart and anxious, but I mean, they don't have a chance. And these are the issues, I know that this was mentioned, I mean, these are the issues where we need to pressure, but there's land issues, water issues, various ways, because at issue is there are very fundamental things about livelihoods, and I'll be quiet about that. But we've just finished doing a very big research project with Afghans on predicting avalanches, for example. It's possible to work with Afghans, and the only way you get good at research is by doing it.
Thank you very much, Bohdan. I think we at least all fully agree with your last sentence. Orzala.
Thank you very much. Just following fellow panelists' comments. With regards to the importance of partnerships, I can also share some experience from AREU. For example, our partnership with university professors in Herat has been excellent in the constitutional review research. There is capacity in some of these institutions. There is potential. It just needs a different approach, because the donors should not focus too much. I mean, one lesson, if we reflect back to what happened in the last 2 decades and with the new situation, of course, the challenges, I fully agree, and I think we have to revisit it. But one key lesson is to really keep also the idea of ensuring that we also see the Afghans as our audience, not only the donors and international community and intervening forces. I mean, for this, AREU has done some excellent work in the past, and I would like to sort of build upon that. For example, at least in the last 6-7 years, we've made a strict rule that no publication can be exempted from Dari and Pashto translation, a good readable quality translation in the 2 local languages. That really helped, because our purpose is to make sure that Afghans in Helmand understand and read the research findings from the Helmand province on the drugs issues, for example, or the similar on other points on another sort of research. So the importance of translation, high quality translation of the products, research products, is really, I think, something to make note of. And secondly, I think the issue of as we move forward, as we move ahead, the issue of ethics becomes really crucial under the new circumstances. And building capacities of the local researchers, of the national researchers, I definitely acknowledge the point that a significant number of researchers have been, forced to leave their country. But I cannot fully agree that there is no researcher left in Afghanistan. We are at 38 million people. A lot of people have had the opportunity of training themselves. And as a result, I think we are now in a time where we need to continue building capacities regardless of the presence or absence of donors or presence or absence of international community. So that is the perspective that at least AREU follows as we move ahead. My sincere apologies for the background noise as I am on the train and I could not change the timing. I'm really sorry about that. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure meeting you all and joining you despite the challenges.
Thank you very much, Orzala. Ali, I'm not sure. You looked as if you wanted to come in on this same point, or am I mistaken?
No, I would agree that there are many people who are left behind, and of course there are many talented people. But there are, as I said, that there is really in order to be able to research in Afghanistan, it really needs, it really depends on the international engagement to allow the structure to operate in Afghanistan, the research structure to operate in Afghanistan. And currently, given the humanitarian situation, everyone is really struggling to survive. And that is one problem. And the second problem is that there are many people, but some of those who built their capacity in the last 20 years, they have now left the country. Now, for example, the three of us Afghan researchers, including Dr. Ursala Nemat and Qayoom Suroush and myself are speaking out of Afghanistan. And of course, we do not say that we are the only researchers, but as a researcher, I'm the product of the last 20 years. And I work with the Afghanistan Analyst Network for more than 5 years. And now we are struggling with their own personal life, and so that is an issue. And there are many other researchers who have left. Of course, it is always important and crucial to start building the capacity for those who are there and they have interest in research. But my point was those who have already developed some sort of research capacity and have left the country. And the second thing is the humanitarian situation in the country that will probably not allow the research structure and institutions in the country to operate unless there is really an engagement from the international community and there is a funding flow to the country.
Thank you very much, Ali. Last question directed to Nishank. Someone asked about the possibilities, the assessment of the possibilities to materialize at least some of the recommendations mentioned in your case study. How do you see this? And please be short.
Thank you very much. I mean, just to really build on to what Dr. Orzala, Qayoom, and Ali have said, we're looking at a new political reality in the country that's taken hold in the country. We're looking at dealing with a highly oppressive regime. So talking about the recommendations that came about from the research that we conducted before the government's collapse. Unfortunately, I think the extent to which those recommendations have a possibility of gaining traction now are very, very bleak. I think what is required is shifting gears, and some of the chats that I've had with the same people that I've reached out to before the collapse and now after the collapse have said it's about preservation. It's preserving that human capital that has been built up in the country at such a high cost over the past 2 decades, and particularly looking at women who have been locked out and from the economy, from employment. So even if they are somehow able to get an education in Afghanistan, what comes next for them? The roads to employment and to have that meaningful employment are closed, and it doesn't look like they're going to be opening. So when the people's agencies have effectively been cut off, it really requires the rethinking about what appropriate recommendations ought to be, such as providing scholarships to Afghans in large numbers. I'm talking about small-scale scholarships, but large-scale scholarships to a large number of Afghans across different disciplines, and to do that in universities around the world, so that those who have invested in those areas have the possibility to pursue those opportunities down the track, and also not to face that repression. So unfortunately, the recommendations that were made prior to the collapse of the government, I think because of the significant structural change in the country, are probably no longer viable.
Thank you very much, Nishank. Thank you to all of you, Nishank, Orzala, Adi, Bohdan, for having participated in this panel. Thank you to IDRC for having sponsored our research. Thank you to Ursina and Finn for having set up this roundtable. And in terms of content, it's work in progress in terms of how to improve knowledge ecosystems, in terms of trying to understand how they work in very specific contexts, like the one of Afghanistan. Personally, I'm taking away the fact that there has been considerable progress achieved over the past 10, 20 years, particularly in terms of the qualification of the people, in terms of capacities for education. But there is still room for improvement, particularly in the realm of research. And this is largely due to financial constraints, financial possibilities. Situation hasn't improved through the events over the past few months, but I take from your contribution that it is not totally hopeless, and that it will be important to look more in detail at what is possible, and where particularly partners from abroad, but also research funders and Afghans themselves could try to dig in order to make sure most of what was achieved doesn't get lost, and things get brighter than they may look like to certain observers right now. Thank you very much to all the panelists.